So I thought for today's episode, I was just going to talk Cuba, and I just it was on my mind with the big protests and everything going on there, and I thought it would be fun to just kind of give my perspective on what's going on there and kind of the history of U.S.-Cuban relations, which is something that I find really, really fascinating. Cuba is a that's a tough one. They're a very interesting country, a very interesting country, and a very interesting little piece of particularly the 20th century. And of course, they're evil, really evil government. But again, just like our government doesn't represent our people, their government shouldn't, represent their people. And in fact, much like with our country, we're the biggest victims of our government, or I should say, we're victimized the most by our own government. We have other countries that are far more victimized by our government. Not the case for Cuba, but their people certainly are victimized by their government, and they're truly awful. But there's also, as you see these protests sparking up, you already see the attempts of kind of the left and the boomer cons to force you into these one of two options that are both terrible. So the options are either like, we have to do something, we have to, we should, I don't know, increase sanctions on the Cubans because of how terrible their government is. Or you have the left-wing thing where it's kind of like this apologizing for the Cuban government and blaming everything on, the embargo and stuff like that. And the only common sense, obvious libertarian position, which is just the correct position, is that their government is evil, and also that we shouldn't have embargoes and sanctions and all of this stuff on Cuba. So that's, to me, that's just the obvious position. But one of the things that's so interesting about Cuba is that they are, if you look at things from the perspective of the empire mentality that the United States of America has, which is the only angle where all of these things start to become clear. It's the only way to look at these things where they start making sense. And we've talked about this a lot with other countries. Like you look at Iran, as a threat to America. Well, that doesn't make any sense if you think of Iran being a threat to America as normal people would think of those terms. Like, obviously, Iran is not going to come over here and hurt America at all. Either that compared to us, a tiny little country, a puny little economy, they don't have they don't have nuclear weapons. Even if they did, they don't have an air force that can deliver nuclear weapons over here. This is a little oil-rich country that struggles to provide its own people with gasoline. And yet somehow you're supposed to believe that this is a threat to America. But if you actually understand what Hillary Clinton and the John McCains and Mike Pompeos of the world are saying, I mean, they may not say it, but what they mean is that it's a threat to the American empire's dominance over the Middle East. And if you look at things like that, it actually makes sense. You're like, oh yeah, Iran actually is a threat. Iran actually is a threat to the American empire's ability to control Iran, right? So that's what this whole thing boils down to. And that's why you hear so much about the human rights abuses in the countries that aren't dominated by the American empire, but not much about the ones that are. And so it's easy to just, you have to look at things through the empire lens if you want to understand any of this shit. So this is why it's like, oh my God, China's human rights abuses, or how is China treating the Uyghurs or whatever, right? But how much do you hear about what Saudi Arabia is doing? I mean, besides from, us constantly talking about what they're doing to the people in Yemen. But you don't hear Mike Pompeo or Hillary Clinton or any of those people being very concerned about Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses, because they're on the side of the empire. So they're, that's just not an issue. So we don't really care about democracy. We don't really care about human rights issues for sure. But controlling the world, taking over the world, that's the goal. And it was going pretty good for a long time, but not so much anymore. But so this, if you look at it this way, now you'll understand why Cuba is such an enemy of the state and has been for so long. And it's also what makes them such an interesting country. Cuba is this tiny little island country that gave the finger to the most powerful empire in the history of the world and survived. That in itself is just really fascinating. Like Castro just straight up gave the finger to the United States of America when it was newly the world empire. So what is it, 1960, that they started having all this beef. Just a few years, 15 years-ish after we've dropped nukes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and declared ourselves the world empire. And they were just like, no, fuck you. Just a few miles off our shores. Gave a big middle finger and survived. And that is just infuriating to the empire. And that's a terrible, if you look at things through that lens. And I understand, by the way, none of them call this the American empire. I mean, they'll call it like the liberal world order or hegemony or like, some other word like that. But what it is America dominating the world. But if you are an empire and you're trying to take over the world, that is a real threat, right? In a sense, because you can't let these other countries see that someone could do that to you and not pay a price for it. So they have to pay in some way or another. And the obvious answer would be, well, we're going to have a regime change there. And America attempted many times, I think like a dozen times or something like that, maybe like 8 or 9 times. They tried to assassinate Fidel Castro, and he was really good at not getting assassinated. I think that was an old Fidel Castro quote that he said something like, if avoiding assassinations were an Olympic sport, I would take gold medal, something like that. So anyway, Fidel Castro is a really evil guy. I mean, he was a communist dictator. Comes along with everything you would expect a communist dictator to have. Just did awful things to his people, brutally put down political dissidents, and put his people into grinding, awful poverty for, his entire reign. But you can acknowledge that and also be like, it's pretty crazy that he gave a big middle finger to Dwight Eisenhower, right? He gave a big middle finger to Dwight Eisenhower, the general who just won World War II. And he ruled Cuba into like Obama's presidency. I mean, he like outlasted all of these guys who he had tensions with. John F. Kennedy was taken out, within a few years of their beef, and Castro went on to rule for decades. And really, I mean, it's not even like he was overthrown. He just got sick at the end of his life and decided to let his brother, take over for the next like 8 years or whatever till he died. I think he died in 2016. So anyway, that in itself is an interesting story. And there's all types of like lessons and things that you can, think about from the history of the Cuban-U.S. relations. Anyway, I just, for this episode, I'm not, as usual, I'm not the expert in any of this shit. I'm not a historian. I'm just a shit talking comedian. But I think there's, like my goal is just to kind of like introduce some of these ideas, maybe encourage you to go read some of the experts on it and try to give, my take on it, which is like a little bit of a different way to think about it.